All right, so a lot of work for developers these days is in creating responsive dashboards. And these dashboards typically have a particular layout. So we're going to look at two types of layouts, a more simple layout and then also a more complex layout. And typically you create them with CSS grid. So make sure you watch the whole video if you want to know how to do that. All right, so with these dashboard layouts, you're typically going to have two types of them. So you're going to have a simple dashboard where you have like a sidebar here, a header, and then the main or the content part, right? So this is usually what you see in practice. However, sometimes you're also going to see some more complicated or complex layout where we still have the sidebar and the header, but then within this main content area, we have a whole layout in and of itself, you could say. Right, so we're going to look at how to create this, but let's start off with the simple layout. Just a simple layout. How would we do this? So in our HTML, you're going to have a header, you're going to have a sidebar, and you're going to have a main, right? Now I have selected them here and I've given them each their background color. All right, now the first thing you have to pay attention to is that we want to take up the entire height here of the viewport. Right, so the viewport is the visible area of the web page. It does not include this address bar here. This is all the browser UI. Also does not include the taskbar if you have one at the bottom. It's just this part of the web page that we can see, and we want it to take up 100% of that. Right. This is typically what you want to do with you know, a lot of dashboards. Right. We don't want to have scrolling, for example. So the first thing I always do is I select the body element, right? The body is just like any other HTML element. We can select it, and I'm selecting it here by tag. I could give it a class, but let's just do it like this. And I'm gonna set its height to 100% of the viewport height. So when we do that, we don't see anything yet, right? So now it's still a blank page. So how do we create this layout? Whenever you have to implement a layout in CSS, you basically have two major options. Option one is Flexbox. And I actually have I have a pretty strong opinion on this. I think you should pretty much always use Flexbox. You cannot use Flexbox. In that case, use option two, which is CSS grid. So if you try building these dashboard layouts, you'll find out pretty quickly that it's pretty difficult to do with Flexbox. So here, this is actually a pretty good example of where I would use CSS grid, right? So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to use CSS grid to implement these layouts. So let's see. The thing with CSS grid is, and with Flexbox as well, is it's always about a parent element and its child elements. So we want to place the header, the sidebar, and the main in a grid. So we want to make their parent element, in this case that's the body, the so-called grid container, which means we're just going to say display grid. And when we do this, this has become the grid container and these elements have become the grid items. Now with CSS grid, you first have to create the grid. That's step one, create the grid. And step two is to place the grid items somewhere in that grid, right? So step one, create the grid. So what would this look like in terms of the grid? And by the way, I have a whole course on CSS. I highly recommend you go through that if you still need to master CSS grid and Flexbox as well, by the way, really important. Yeah, it's just really crucial as a front end or full stack developer that you master these concepts, right? There are other concepts in CSS that you have to know as well. So definitely check out the whole course, right? So here, just to quickly create this grid, we're going to have two columns, right? One column here for the sidebar and another bigger column here for everything else. And then we can have two rows, right? One row here for the header, right? And this part of the sidebar, and then another very large row for everything else. So let's see. We're going to use grid template columns for this. So columns, we want the first column to be 300 pixels wide. So what you can just say is 300 pixels, right? And then the second column, this big one, should simply take up everything else, right? All the available space. So what you can do, instead of hard coding a value like this, because it would depend on how wide my viewport is, right? So hard coding a specific value is not a good idea because it's not going to take up everything else, or it's going to be more. So instead, what you can do is use the fractional unit. This is going to be a portion of the available space that this second column, right, second value here, so second column should take up. And since this is the only column competing for that available space, right, this is the only column that has that fractional unit, it's simply going to take up everything else. Okay, so then we also have grid template rows. We're going to have two rows. The first one, well, should be 60 pixels tall because that's how big we want the header to be. So we're going to say 60 pixels. And then it's the same story. The other row should simply take up everything else. So we're simply going to use a fractional unit here. You can use it with any number, by the way, because it's the only one competing for that available space. Now the row, by the way, it's important that you set the height of the body to 100% of the viewport height, which is what we've already done. Otherwise this will not work because it's going to take up all the available space, but the body it's not going to have much height, right? So it's not going to stretch all the way to the bottom. Right, so we need to make that, that's why we set it right here. Okay, so let's see what we have. This is the example, right? So now we're gonna go to our project, gonna refresh, and there is gonna be some default behavior, right? So we have now created the grid and the browser has some default behavior. So it's gonna try to automatically place these grid items somewhere in that grid. So now we have a bit of a strange layout, but that's because of the auto or the automatic default placement kicking in. Now, if you right click and go to the inspector tools, we can actually see the grid that we created. And this is going to help us with step 2, which is placing the grid items correctly in the grid. Unfortunately, it shows these numbers, these grid lines, in very small. So I cannot make this bigger, sorry for that. But basically it says the 1 here, like 1, 2, and 3, right? And on the left side as well, 1, 2, 3. And we can use these numbers to place the grid items, the header, sidebar, and main, in the grid. So the header, if we look at the header, we want the header, well, let's see. The header should be in column 2 on the first row. So we can use these numbers, right? Grid line should go from grid line number 2 until grid line number 3, right? For the column. So what you would do is you would go to the header, and I'll just add some space here, right? So that it's clear that this is for the layout or for the grid. So for the column, it should go from grid line number 2. So we say 2 and then / 3. That's where it should end. That's for the column. And then for the row, well, it should go from grid line number 1 until grid line number 2, right? That's the first row. Okay, let's see what we get if we do that. And then let's also, right, it still doesn't look good because of that auto default placement for the other ones. So now let's take a look at the sidebar. The sidebar should sit in column 1 and it should actually span both rows, right? So let's quickly do that. Again, if you are not familiar with CSS Grid yet, I highly recommend you go through my course. Grid row, right? So it should go from the start, right? That's grid line number 1 all the way till the end. That's actually grid line number 3. So let's see. All right. So now this one is actually taking up the correct space. It's actually kicking the main area accidentally into the correct space as well. But let's make it explicit. This grid area should sit in the second column, right? On the second row. So let's see. Right. So an easy way to remember this is second column, right? So it should start with grid line number 2. It should span one column, so it's 2 plus 1. So the other number is 3, right? Same for the row, right? So now we've created the grid and we have placed the grid items in the grid, and we have our simple dashboard layout. We can now continue with adding like a table here, or maybe you have a heading, right? Orders, right? Or users, right? And maybe you have stuff in the header, you have stuff in the sidebar, but this is the overall layout. Now, sometimes you may actually want the header to be on top here, right? So then you would simply, let's see, it should span from grid line number 1 to grid line number 3, and the sidebar should start from the second row. So here it should start from line number 2. And then this is what you get, right? So this is an alternative layout, right? So this is how you could create that. Now, another popular way of writing this, let me actually undo this, right? So another popular way of writing this is to actually use a more advanced feature of CSS Grid, which is called grid template areas, right? So we still have step 1, create the grid, but now there's a different way of placing the grid items in the grid, which is very popular, especially with these bigger like macro layouts. So we still have the grid, right? We still have created the grid. You can also see that here in the inspector tools, we still have the grid, right? So now what we can also do, let me actually refresh here. So we have the default placement, right? Because I removed that. So it's going to be a mess, but we still have the grid like before. Now what we can also do is we can give names to areas in the grid. So I can say the first column here with these 2 rows, I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call that simply site. And then I can go to this element here, sidebar, and I can say, go sit in the area named site, right? So I'm going to give these areas a name. So I can say grid template areas. And typically people press enter here and they make it a bit graphical like this. So we can say, right, so we basically have a 2x2 grid here, right? 2 columns and 2 rows. So here on the first row, in the first column, I'm going to call that site, right? And then the other part is something for the header. So I'm going to call that header. Then on the second row on the first column, that's also going to be for the site. So I'm going to call it site. And then we have the second column in the second row. That's going to be for the main, right? So let me go out of here. Right, so now I have given this 2x2 grid, those areas, I've assigned a name to those areas, right? So now I can go to the header and I can say, right, we're now in step 2, place the grid items somewhere in the grid. So I can say to this header, go sit in the area called header, right? I can go to the sidebar and I can say, go sit in the area. Actually, let me just do it like this. Go sit in the area with the name site. And the main, go sit in the area with the name main. So when I save here and refresh, you can see we get the same layout, right? So this is an alternative way of writing this. It's a little bit more advanced, but you're going to see this in practice quite often. Now, in terms of responsiveness, by the way, this is pretty straightforward, right? So here, we don't really have to do much. It really depends on what you have in here. You're going to have to work on that, most likely. But here in terms of the overall layout, you know, we could make the sidebar, we could collapse that, right? We could make that much smaller. But other than that, we don't really have to do much in terms of responsiveness. Okay, so now I want to show you how to implement a more complex layout, right? So this is a very common type of layout that you're going to see with e-commerce, for example, right? You could have like the orders of today, the number of transactions, you know, the number of shipments received or returns or whatever, right? Maybe some graph of the overall revenue for the past, you know, 2 weeks or something, right? So this would be pretty typical e-commerce layout. You can see the difference is mostly that within this main area we have a whole layout in and of itself. Right? So how can we create this? I'm just going to go to the HTML, and here in the main then we have, well, basically I'm just going to call these cards, right? So we basically just have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards, and they can have their own information. But I'm just going to add 6 cards here, right? So just card 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, I'm gonna save here and I will quickly give them a background color, right? So these cards have a particular background color and a certain border radius, right? So I'm just gonna add that here. Now, if I do this, we have 6 cards now and I've given them a background color, but we don't see them yet because they don't have any size, right? So previously, the header, the sidebar, and the main, also we have not given them a size ourselves, right? We have not said, oh, height should be 100 pixels or the width should be 300 pixels, right? But we still see the header and the sidebar and the main here, right? Because they have that background color. So they still have that size. How is that possible? Well, that's because they are grid items, and the grid items as a default stretch all the way to take up their space in the grid, right? So the first row here is 60 pixels, and we've placed the header in that first row, and so it will get stretched in both directions, both vertical and horizontal. So vertically, this header has been stretched to take up that space. That's why we see the header here. With these cards are not sitting in a grid because a grid is between the parent element and its child elements. These cards are a grandchild of the grid container, right? But they are not sitting in the grid here. So they don't have any size, and so we don't see them, right? Now, when you deal with a layout like this, what you're gonna have is nested layout. So here, what we're gonna do is we're gonna use CSS grid again. We're gonna create a new grid, and we're gonna place these cards. These are gonna be grid items in that grid, right? So you can nest grids, and it actually works as expected. It sounds very complex, but you have to understand this main element is a grid item in relation to this body element, right? But it itself can also be a grid container in relation to these card elements, to its child element, right? So this main area, we've placed it in that grid, right? Because it's a grid item, but we can also make it a grid container itself in relation to its own child element, right? So that's what we're gonna do now. This main will just become a grid. And so we're gonna have columns and rows. So let's see, we could have one column, right? Another column and another column. So we're gonna have 3 columns and they're all gonna be equally big. And then also 3 rows, right? Row number 1, row number 2, and row number 3. So we would use, right, step 1, create the grid template columns. They're all going to be equally big. So I'm just going to give them one fraction of the available space, right? So they're all going to take up the same portion. And then we're going to have grid template rows. Right, so now I have created the grid in the main area, and you can actually see that, right? Once you created the grid, the browser will automatically place the grid items somewhere in the grid. There is some default placement. And because of that, the grid items automatically stretch to take up their space. And actually they're placed in one grid cell. So the browser tries to put the first grid item in the first cell, right? First column in the first row. Then the second cell is the second column on the first row, then the third one, right? So we actually have these 6 grid items now sitting next to each other. And it looks a little bit strange because here they have some more space between them. So that's actually just a gap. And we can add that very quickly here. We can add a gap, both column gap and row gap with just a gap. So let's see what we get if we do that. Okay, so then we have more space between them, but also we want their space outside, right? So in this whole area, there should also be some space on the side. And that's just padding, right? So we can also just give this main area some padding on all sides, top, bottom, left, right. Okay, so now we want to place these grid items correctly in the grid. For placing grid items, we can use 2 ways, right? So for placing those grid items, we can use those grid line numbers. It's very common. Or we can use grid template areas again. We can assign a name to those areas and then just tell those cards each individually, hey, you go sit in that particular area. Let's actually do that. So we're going to say grid template areas, right? So here, I'll write it like how people would do it in the real world. So we have 3 rows. So I can say here, the first column on the first row, that should be for card 1. So I'm just going to say C1, right? This one should be for C2, right? So I'm just going to use C1, C2 all the way till 6, right? C3, okay. Now the second row, this big one should be for C4, right? Both columns. So the second column on this row as well. And then this smaller one is C5, but then here on the bottom, it's C4 again, right? So I can say C4, oops. And then the last one here in the corner is going to be C6, right? So now I have only given a name to those areas. It does not place them in those areas. So now I have to select each card individually. So I can do that like this, card. Well, I can say select the card that is a first child. So I can say nth child 1, and I can tell that card go sit in the grid area with a name of C1, right? And let's see, when I do that, nothing changes because actually by default it was already placed there. So I can do this for the other 5 as well. Let's quickly do that. Okay, so now I'm selecting the 4th one, and this one actually takes up more space, so we can already check to see if that works. And you can see this one now indeed is taking up that area. We can't actually see if these are actually number 5 and 6 or the other way around. So let's actually do that for 5 and 6 as well. Right, so sometimes you're lucky and just by default placement, or this one kicked out those 2, so they have to go somewhere else. And just by default placement, you get the correct layout. But I like to be, explicit. Because maybe later with responsiveness, for example, as we'll see, you may need to change the order or you may need to change something. So it's good to be explicit and specific. Okay, so then we get the layout that we want, right? So now we have a nested CSS grid within the overall grid. And actually, within these cards, let's say you have, like a little heading, like a number of orders. And then on the other side, you have the actual number, maybe 25, right? So for a little layout like that, you may actually want to use Flexbox. In fact, I actually would use Flexbox for those type of little layouts, Flexbox is just very suitable for those types of layouts. And so that would mean that you're going to have a, a Flexbox within this grid, which itself is sitting in a bigger grid, you could say, right? So and that's the real world. You're going to have a mix of Flexbox and the grid on your websites and web applications, and it actually works as expected, right? So it's always about a parent element and a child element. And definitely do not use CSS grid for everything. In fact, for for something like 95% of layouts out there, you actually do want to use Flexbox, especially for those smaller types of layouts. And this was just one pretty rare example of where CSS grid is actually very suitable. So it's important that you master both Flexbox and CSS grid. So if you haven't mastered both of them yet, definitely check out my professional CSS course. Okay, now about responsiveness, let's see how that would work here. Right, so here's where we have our layout. Now, if we make it smaller and smaller, at some point we do have to change something. So probably you're gonna have to make the sidebar much smaller and only display like the icons. That's very common. Now, even with that though, eventually the stuff in here is going to be too cramped. And so you're going to have to change this particular layout, right? So let's say at like, just a quick example here. Let's say at 925 pixels, right? We could write a quick media query. We could say at media, window width is at most 925 pixels. In that case, what usually happens is that you're gonna, make it a one column layout. So everything is gonna be stacked and you're gonna have some scrolling, for example. So you could do something like grid template columns, right? This main area is still a grid container, right? We say display grid, but now we're gonna change the grid. So instead of 3 columns, we're gonna go to one column layout, right? So not one FR, one FR, one FR. We're gonna have one column now. In terms of rows, well, it's gonna be stacked, right? So we're gonna have 6 rows, right? Because there can only be one, because we only want one element on each row. So we could do something like each row, well, how tall do we want them to be? Well, maybe something like 200 pixels. So we could write 200 pixels 6 times. Or, if you have to repeat yourself a lot like that, there is actually a built-in repeat function that we can use. We want to have 6 rows that are each 200 pixels tall. And if we do that, let's see what we get. So we get this because we are still using those grid template areas and those cards, I mean. So we need to undo that basically, because right now we're still placing them in some grid area. So if you want to undo that, what you can do is say initial. So now it's going to basically reset, right? So for all those cards, we want to go back to the initial value. Now that won't work because we actually run into a specificity issue here, because here I'm selecting this card with a more specific selector, right? Nth child. And here I'm just selecting it by the class, right? So this is actually more specific. And so if you, quick dirty way of getting rid of that issue is simply using important. I could also use nth child here for all of them and then repeat myself. But I'm just gonna do it a quick and dirty way just to quickly show you that everything works. So when we do this, let's see. Yeah, so now it's almost finished. We also need to undo the grid template areas here on the grid container initial. So really just get rid of that whole areas idea. So when we do that, you could say we have a new grid basically, and we have not specifically placed the cards in the grid. There is actually just some default placement that in this case actually is what we want, which is like a stacked layout, right? So you can see with, and each item will be 200 pixels tall because they get stretched in the area or in the part of the grid that they are placed in. So since these rows are each 200 pixels tall, that's how tall they will be, these cards, right? And then of course it really depends on the exact content in here, but this is just an example, right? So that's how you can create these modern dashboard layouts.
By the way, if this was helpful, I'd really appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Also, check out my courses on CSS and JavaScript if you want to take those skills to an advanced level, because in there we will build some beautiful real-world projects from scratch so you can see how everything fits together and really master CSS or JavaScript. And I will also release other courses soon like React and Node.js. So if you want to be notified, then make sure you are subscribed to the email newsletter. You can find the link in the description. Thanks for watching and I hope to see you soon.